A young slave helped his master's wife with her horse, and she instantly fell in love with him, changing both their fates forever. Eleanor Montgomery, the beautiful but lonely wife of one of Virginia's wealthiest plantation owners, had never looked twice at the men who worked her husband's fields. But in those breathless seconds, as Solomon's strong hand steadied her horse at the edge of disaster, something changed in her heart forever. Their eyes met, and in that forbidden glance, a dangerous passion was born, one that would risk everything they had in a world that would never accept their love. Eleanor Montgomery stared out the window of her lavish bedroom, watching the sprawling fields of her husband's plantation stretch toward the horizon. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens and whitewashed slave quarters beyond. 3 months into her marriage to Richard Montgomery, one of Virginia's most powerful landowners, and she'd already learned that wealth did not guarantee happiness. Richard was 20 years her senior, cold and distant, more concerned with his business affairs and political connections than with his young bride. The grand mansion that had once seemed like a palace now felt more like an ornate prison. "Perhaps some fresh air might lift my spirits," she whispered to herself, running her fingers along the silk curtains. Her reflection in the polished glass showed a beautiful woman with sad eyes. At 19, Eleanor had been the belle of Richmond society, with suitors lined up at her father's door, but it was Richard Montgomery's proposal that her parents had accepted with barely disguised delight. His fortune and influence had outweighed all other considerations, including Eleanor's happiness. She rang the small silver bell on her dressing table, summoning her maid to help her change into her riding habit. The dark blue velvet complemented her fair complexion and auburn hair, which she insisted on wearing in a simple style, despite the elaborate fashions of the day. "Will Mr. Montgomery be joining you this afternoon, ma'am?" asked Mary, her lady's maid, as she fastened the buttons at Eleanor's wrists. Eleanor suppressed a bitter laugh. "I doubt my husband even remembers I ride, Mary. He's been locked in his study with those cotton brokers since breakfast." An hour later, Eleanor was galloping across the countryside on Tempest, her spirited Arabian mare. The wind in her hair and the powerful animal beneath her were her only true freedoms in a life that had become a gilded cage. She urged the horse faster, relishing the momentary escape. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against earth seemed to match her heartbeat, and for these precious minutes she could forget her loneliness, forget the whispered arguments she overheard between her husband and his business partners. Forget the cries she sometimes heard at night from the quarters beyond the main house. The plantation's vast grounds gave way to a less contour 7-4 tended path that wound through a copse of ancient oak trees. Eleanor knew she had strayed farther than propriety allowed for a woman riding alone, but the thrill of small rebellion only added to her enjoyment. Tempest seemed to share her mistress's mood, tossing her head and snorting with pleasure at the chance to run freely. Without warning, a large water moccasin slithered across their path, its diamond-patterned body undulating over sun-dappled leaves. Tempest reared violently, front hooves pawing at the air, nearly throwing Eleanor from the saddle. The mare bolted, eyes rolling white with fear, heading straight toward the rocky ravine at the edge of the property, a treacherous drop of nearly 40 feet to the creek below. "Whoa! Stop!" Eleanor cried, pulling desperately on the reins, her knuckles white with effort. But Tempest was beyond reason, charging toward certain death for them both. Eleanor's thoughts flashed to her parents, to the life she'd barely lived. The ravine's edge approached with terrifying speed, rocks and loose soil already beginning to skitter beneath Tempest's thundering hooves. Suddenly, a figure darted from between the trees, directly into Tempest's path. With astonishing courage that bordered on recklessness, the man grabbed the bridle, his heels digging into the earth as he was nearly dragged along. He spoke in low, soothing tones, words Eleanor couldn't distinguish over the blood pounding in her ears and Tempest's frightened whinnies. "Easy now, lady. Easy there. No harm coming to you." The voice gradually became clearer as the horse's pace faltered, then slowed. The man's hands moved with practiced confidence, stroking Tempest's lathered neck while maintaining a firm grip on the bridle. The mare's panicked breathing gradually steadied under his calm command, her ears flicking forward then back as she listened to his voice. "That's it. You're a good girl. Smart girl," he murmured, never breaking eye contact with the animal. There was something almost magical in the way man and beast communicated. A language of trust that transcended words. Only when they had safely stopped, barely 10 feet from the ravine's crumbling edge, did Eleanor look down at her rescuer. He was young, perhaps her age or a few years older, with broad shoulders and skin the color of burnished mahogany. His face was handsome, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, but it was his eyes that captured her, intelligent and deep, the color of amber in sunlight. Those eyes held her gaze for just a moment too long before remembering to cast themselves downward. His hands, still gripping the bridle, were strong yet gentle, with long fingers that could have belonged to an artist or musician. "Thank you," Eleanor breathed, her heart racing from more than just the near accident. A strand of hair had come loose from her riding hat, falling across her flushed cheek. "You saved my life. We would have surely gone over the edge." "It was nothing, ma'am," he replied, his voice unexpectedly refined, with none of the exaggerated dialect she had grown accustomed to hearing from the field hands. The horse was just frightened. Any creature would react the same to such a surprise. She hesitated, suddenly aware of his worn clothing, the rough cotton shirt and simple trousers that marked him as one of the plantation's slaves. The realization brought a complicated mix of emotions she wasn't prepared to examine. "You work for my husband?" "Never." "Yes, ma'am. Solomon. I tend to the horses sometimes, when the stable master allows it." There was a quiet dignity in how he introduced himself, offering only his first name as was customary, yet somehow maintaining a sense of identity that transcended his status. As he helped her dismount, their hands touched briefly. Eleanor felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so immediate and powerful it frightened her more than the runaway horse had. She withdrew her hand quickly, smoothing her riding habit with trembling fingers. "I've never seen anyone calm a horse like that," she said, searching for something to say that would allow her to keep looking at him without seeming improper. "Even Mr. Patterson, our stable master, struggles with Tempest when she's in one of her moods." "Animals know when you respect them," Solomon replied. A flicker of something pride, perhaps, or passion for his skill crossing his face before he carefully masked it. "They can sense fear and kindness alike. Horses especially, they're smarter than most people give them credit for." "Where did you learn such skill?" she asked, genuinely curious. Tempest now stood placidly beside them, nuzzling Solomon's shoulder as if they were old friends. He hesitated, clearly weighing his response. "My father worked with horses on a plantation in Kentucky before I was sold here." The last words were spoken quietly, a reminder of the brutal reality that governed their different worlds. Eleanor felt a flush of shame at her thoughtless question, yet found herself wanting to know more about this man who spoke so eloquently and handled horses with such natural grace. As they walked back toward the main house, Eleanor leading Tempest by the reins, while Solomon kept a respectful distance beside them, she found herself stealing glances at this man who moved with such quiet confidence despite his station. She asked him questions about the horses, about how he'd learned to handle them so well. Anything to prolong their conversation. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the path and illuminating Solomon's profile in brief, golden moments. Eleanor noticed the careful way he chose his words, the intelligence behind his measured responses, so at odds with what her husband and his friends claimed about their slaves' capabilities. "Mrs. Montgomery," A voice called from ahead. It was Mr. Patterson, the stable master, his face red with exertion as he hurried toward them. "We've been looking everywhere for you." Mr. Montgomery was concerned when your ride went longer than expected. Eleanor doubted her husband had noticed her absence at all. More likely, dinner was approaching, and he expected her to be properly dressed and ready to entertain whatever guests he had invited without consulting her. Tempest was spooked by a snake, she explained, watching Patterson's expression darken as he noticed Solomon. "This man saved us from going over the ravine edge. He has quite a way with horses." Patterson barely acknowledged the heroism. "Get back to your work, boy," he snapped at Solomon. "The north field needs tending." Solomon nodded, his face now an unreadable mask. "Yes, sir." He turned to Eleanor and bowed slightly. "Ma'am." As he walked away, Eleanor felt a strange emptiness, as if something precious had been snatched away before she fully understood its value. She handed Tempest's reins to the stable master, her eyes still following Solomon's retreating figure. What Eleanor didn't yet realize was that the real danger wasn't the fall from her horse, but the fall of her heart for a man she was never supposed to see as human. And in the antebellum south of 1858, such feelings weren't merely inappropriate, they were potentially deadly for them both. That night, Eleanor sat stiffly at the massive mahogany dining table, barely touching the elaborate meal prepared by the household staff. Richard Montgomery occupied the opposite end, 20 feet of polished wood and silver candelabras, separating them a physical manifestation of their emotional distance. Two of her husband's business associates flanked the table, discussing cotton prices and shipping routes, while Eleanor struggled to maintain the appearance of an attentive hostess. "The Liverpool markets are showing promising returns," Richard was saying, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. At 45, he remained handsome in a severe way. His dark hair graying at the temples, his posture military straight. "If we increase production by 20% next season, we stand to double our profits." "Ambitious, Montgomery," remarked Thomas Whitfield, a neighboring plantation owner. "You'll need to expand your workforce considerably." "Already arranged," Richard replied with a self-satisfied smile. "I've purchased 30 new workers from a plantation in Georgia that's facing bankruptcy. They arrive next week." Eleanor's fork clattered against her plate. The casual way they discussed human beings as mere commodities had always disturbed her, but tonight it felt unbearable. The image of Solomon's dignified face flashed in her mind. "Are you unwell, Mrs. Montgomery?" asked the second guest, a banker named Harrington. "Just tired from my ride today," she replied, forcing a smile. "I had quite an adventure with Tempest." Richard frowned. "Patterson mentioned something about that. You really shouldn't ride that animal unaccompanied, Eleanor. It's not proper, and clearly not safe. One of your slaves prevented what could have been a serious accident," she said, watching her husband's face. "He showed remarkable skill with horses." Richard barely glanced up from his plate. "Yes. Well, that's what they're for, to be useful. Speaking of which, Whitfield, have you implemented that new discipline system we discussed? I've found it quite effective at maximizing productivity." The conversation shifted again to methods of plantation management that made Eleanor's stomach turn. She requested permission to withdraw early, citing a headache. Richard waved her away without interrupting his conversation. In the sanctuary of her bedroom, Eleanor dismissed her maid after changing into her nightgown. She moved to the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains to gaze out at the moonlit grounds. Somewhere out there, in the slave quarters beyond the gardens, was Solomon. Was he sleeping now, or sitting awake like her, thinking of their chance encounter? "This is madness," she whispered to herself, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. One brief meeting, and her thoughts were consumed by a man she should barely acknowledge. A man who, in the eyes of the law and society, was her husband's property, yet she couldn't forget the intelligence in his eyes, the gentle confidence in his hands as he calmed Tempest, the refined way he spoke. In those few minutes, he had shown more consideration and humanity than Richard had in 3 months of marriage. Eleanor turned from the window, troubled by the direction of her thoughts. On her writing desk lay her journal, bound in soft leather, a wedding gift from her mother. She hesitated only briefly before sitting down and taking up her pen. The 15th of August, 1858. Today, I nearly died. Tempest was spooked by a snake and nearly carried us both over Blackwater Ravine. I was saved by a slave named Solomon, who showed extraordinary courage and skill. There was something in a manner in his eyes that I cannot forget. He spoke like an educated man, handled my horse with a gentle mastery I've never witnessed. I find myself wondering about him, who he truly is, beneath the role he's been forced to play. What dreams might he harbor? What life might he have lived had he been born free? These thoughts are dangerous, I know. Yet I cannot help but question everything I've been taught to believe about the people my husband owns. If Solomon possesses such dignity and intelligence, how many others have minds and hearts that society refuses to acknowledge? I am a married woman, the mistress of Montgomery Plantation, yet tonight I lie awake, my thoughts returning again and again to a brief encounter in the woods, to a pair of amber eyes that seemed to see into my very soul. God, forgive me for these feelings I cannot name, cannot acknowledge, cannot possibly act upon. Eleanor closed the journal, her hand trembling slightly. Writing the words had made her confused, emotions more real, more frightening. She locked the journal in her desk drawer, knowing that even these private thoughts would be considered scandalous, perhaps even treasonous, in Virginia society. As she slipped into her bed, the distant sound of a spiritual drifted from the slave quarters, a haunting melody that spoke of suffering and hope intertwined. Eleanor lay awake long into the night, the song merging with her troubled dreams, where she ran through endless woods, searching for something just beyond her reach. The following morning, Eleanor rose earlier than usual. Richard had already left for his study, where he would remain until afternoon, managing the plantation's extensive business affairs. She dressed simply, informing Mary that she intended to visit the stables to check on Tempest after yesterday's fright. "Would you like me to send for Mr. Patterson to accompany you, Ma'am?" Mary asked, pinning Eleanor's hair in a practical style. Replied, avoiding her maid's curious gaze. "I'll only be a moment." The stables were located beyond the formal gardens. A large, well-maintained structure that housed Richard's prized horses. The morning air was fresh with dew, the plantation slowly coming to life around her. Field hands were already making their way to the cotton fields, overseers barking orders from horseback. Eleanor entered the cool dimness of the stable, the familiar smells of hay, leather, and horses greeting her. Tempest nickered softly from her stall, recognizing her mistress. Eleanor approached, stroking the mare's velvety nose. "Good morning, beautiful girl," she murmured. "No worse for wear after our adventure, I see." "She's been checked thoroughly, Ma'am," came a voice from behind her. "No injuries, though she was still a bit nervous last evening." Eleanor's heart leaped as she turned to find Solomon mucking out a nearby stall. He kept his eyes respectfully lowered, rake in hand, but she could see the same quiet dignity in his bearing. "I'm glad to hear it," she replied, struggling to maintain a casual tone. "And I never properly thanked you for your bravery yesterday. You risked your life to save mine." "Any man would have done the same, Mrs. Montgomery." "No," she said with unexpected firmness. "Not any man would have had the courage or the skill. I owe you my life, Solomon." He looked up then, their eyes meeting briefly before he remembered his place and looked down again. In that fleeting moment, Eleanor saw something that made her breath catch, not just intelligence, but a depth of feeling. carefully guarded. "May I ask you something?" she said, lowering her voice, though they appeared to be alone. Solomon nodded cautiously. "You speak differently, then." She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't offend. "Your education seems—" "My first master's wife taught me to read," he said quietly, glancing toward the stable door to ensure they weren't overheard. "She was from Philadelphia, with different ideas. I was a house servant then, until I was sold to pay her husband's debts after she died." Eleanor felt a chill at the casual reminder of how lives could be uprooted, human connections severed by the stroke of a pen and exchange of money. "And the horses?" she asked. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "That was my father's gift to me. He trained the finest racing horses in Kentucky before he was sold south. I was just a boy. But he taught me everything he knew in the time we had." The personal history, shared in those few sentences, moved Eleanor deeply. Here was a man with talents, knowledge, and a past filled with loss, not the simple, childlike creature her husband and his friends described when discussing their property. "I would like to learn more," she said, impulsively. "About handling horses properly, I mean. Yesterday showed me that my skills are inadequate. Perhaps you could—" "Mrs. Montgomery." Patterson's voice rang out as he entered the stable, his face darkening at the sight of them conversing. "I wasn't informed you would be visiting this morning." Eleanor straightened, summoning the authority of her position. "I don't require permission to check on my own horse, Mr. Patterson. I was just telling this man that I would like him to help train Tempest. She responded well to him yesterday." Patterson's face reddened. "With all due respect, ma'am, this boy has field duties. He's only here this morning because we're short-handed." "Then reassign him," Eleanor said with a confidence that surprised even herself. "My husband values these horses greatly. Surely he would want them handled by someone with exceptional skill." She turned to Solomon. "Can you be here tomorrow morning? I usually ride at 10. Solomon's face remained impassive, but she caught the flicker of surprise in his eyes. "If Mr. Patterson allows it, ma'am." "He will," Eleanor said, meeting the stable master's angry gaze with a cool stare. "My husband shall hear of your reluctance to accommodate my safety concerns should you refuse." It was a bold move, perhaps foolish. Richard rarely took interest in her activities, but his prized horses were another matter. Patterson knew this, and after a moment of tense silence, he nodded stiffly. "As you wish, Mrs. Montgomery. He'll be available at 10 tomorrow." Eleanor nodded, heart pounding at her own daring. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson. That will be all." As she left the stable, Eleanor felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and fear. She had created an opportunity to see Solomon again, to speak with him, but to what end? These feelings, this curiosity, could lead nowhere good. Yet she could not deny the pull she felt toward him, like a compass needle finding true north. Behind her, in the shadowed stable, Solomon watched her go, his own thoughts equally troubled. In saving Eleanor Montgomery from a dangerous fall, he now faced a different kind of peril altogether, one that could cost him far more than his life. For the next 2 weeks, Eleanor arrived at the stables promptly at 10 each morning. To any observer, including the increasingly suspicious Patterson, she appeared to be taking riding lessons, improving her seat, learning to better control Tempest, and mastering more advanced equestrian skills. In truth, while she did benefit from Solomon's remarkable knowledge of horsemanship, these daily meetings had become something far more profound. "You sit too rigidly," Solomon instructed as they rode side by side along the eastern trail, far from prying eyes. He had been given permission to ride one of the less valuable horses to properly demonstrate techniques. The horse feels your tension, move with her, like you're dancing together. Eleanor adjusted her posture, feeling Tempest respond immediately beneath her. "Like this. Better." He nodded, a rare smile briefly illuminating his face. You learn quickly. I have an excellent teacher, she replied, returning his smile with a warmth that would have scandalized Richmond society. These rides had become the center of Eleanor's existence. During them, a careful transformation occurred as they ventured farther from the plantation. The rigid boundaries between them gradually dissolved. Their conversations, initially restricted to horses and riding, had expanded to literature, philosophy, and their vastly different life experiences. How did you manage to read so much? Eleanor asked, as they allowed their horses to drink from a stream. Surely you didn't have access to many books. Solomon's expression grew distant. Mrs. Caldwell, my first master's wife, had an extensive library. After she taught me to read, she would leave books where I could find them while cleaning. Later, when I served at dinner parties, I would listen to the guests discuss politics, literature, science. I remembered everything. And since coming here, your husband's study has many books, he said carefully. Sometimes, when cleaning, I can read a few pages. I have a good memory. The casual reminder of the vast gulf between their worlds, that Solomon could only steal moments of learning while she had entire libraries at her disposal, struck Eleanor like a physical blow. What was your favorite book? She asked, trying to recapture the momentary equality of their intellectual exchange. Milton's Paradise Lost, he replied without hesitation. To made next, the struggle against tyranny, even when doomed to fail. It spoke to me. Eleanor studied him, marveling at the depth of thought behind his carefully guarded expressions. In these private moments, he allowed his true self to emerge, articulate, thoughtful, passionate about ideas. She had never met anyone, of any station or color, with whom she connected so deeply. Tomorrow, she said impulsively, I'll bring you something to read, something you haven't encountered before. His eyes widened in alarm. Mrs. Montgomery, if I were caught with a book, you won't be, she insisted. You can read it during our rides and return it afterward. No one will know. The risk was significant for them both. Yet the next day Eleanor brought a slim volume of Emerson's essays hidden in her riding jacket. The look of wonder on Solomon's face as she handed it to him was worth any danger. As autumn painted the Virginia countryside in brilliant hues of red and gold, their daily rides extended longer. Eleanor invented excuses for her prolonged absences, health concerns requiring fresh air, a desire to explore the full extent of her husband's property. Richard, preoccupied with business matters and the upcoming harvest, paid little attention to his wife's activities. But others noticed. Mary, her lady's maid, observed her mistress's flushed cheeks and bright eyes upon returning from rides. Patterson's suspicious glances followed them as they departed the stables each day. Whispers began among the house servants about the mistress's unusual interest in a particular slave. We should be more careful, Solomon warned one crisp October morning as they sat beneath a massive oak tree, their horses grazing nearby. He had been reading aloud from Wordsworth's poetry, his rich voice giving the verses new meaning for Eleanor. Patterson has been asking questions of the other stable hands. Eleanor sighed, leaning back against the rough bark. What exactly are we doing that's so wrong? Taking riding lessons? Discussing literature? Solomon gave her a long look that made her cheeks warm. They both knew their connection had grown far beyond riding lessons or literary discussions. Nothing improper had occurred between them. No declarations, no touch beyond what was necessary for riding instruction. Yet the emotional intimacy they shared was, in the eyes of Southern society, a transgression worse than any physical indiscretion. You know the danger better than I do, he said quietly. If anyone suspected. The unfinished sentence hung between them. For Eleanor, discovery would mean disgrace and ostracism. For Solomon, it would mean something far worse. Sometimes I dream of a different world, she whispered, plucking a crimson leaf from the ground, where people are judged by their character and minds rather than the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Such worlds exist, Solomon replied. In Boston, in New York, there are communities where free black men can own businesses, attend universities. You've thought of escape, Eleanor said. It wasn't a question. His silence was answer enough. I could help you, she said, the words tumbling out before she could consider their implications. My father has connections in Philadelphia, money for passage, papers. Stop, Solomon said sharply, his eyes suddenly intense. Don't say such things. Not even here. The very thought is treason in Virginia. But if you could be free, at what cost to you? He interrupted. They hang women for aiding escaped slaves, even white women of your standing. The reality of their situation crashed down upon Eleanor with renewed force. This wasn't a novel or poem with a guaranteed happy ending. This was Virginia in 1858, where the mere suggestion of equality between races could incite violence. We should return, Solomon said, rising and offering her a hand up with careful propriety. You've been gone nearly 3 hours. People will talk. Eleanor allowed him to help her mount, their fingers touching briefly in the process. Even that small contact sent a current of awareness through her that she could no longer deny. In these past weeks, she had fallen hopelessly, impossibly in love with Solomon. As they rode back toward Montgomery Plantation, the autumn sun casting long shadows before them, Eleanor made a silent vow. Whatever happened, whatever it cost her, she would find a way for Solomon to have the freedom and dignity he deserved, even if it meant she would never see him again. Eleanor returned to find the plantation in unusual activity. Carriages lined the circular drive, and servants rushed about with luggage and refreshments. What's happening? She asked a house slave carrying linens toward the guest wing. Master's special guests arrived early, ma'am, the woman replied. From Richmond and Charleston. They're staying through the harvest festival. Eleanor's heart sank. She had forgotten Richard's mention of hosting important business associates and their families. The next 2 weeks would be filled with formal dinners, hunting parties, and social obligations that would make it impossible to continue her daily rides with Solomon. She hurried to her rooms to change, finding Mary waiting with a bath already drawn and her best afternoon dress laid out. Mr. Montgomery has been asking for you, Mom, Mary said, her tone carefully neutral as she helped Eleanor out of her riding habit. He seemed concerned about your absence. I lost track of time, Eleanor replied, stepping into the warm bath. The autumn colors were so beautiful today. Mary's hands paused briefly as she gathered the discarded riding clothes. Mrs. Montgomery, if I may speak freely? Eleanor tensed. Of course, Mary. There's talk among the servants. About you and the stable hand. Mary's voice dropped to a whisper. Mr. Patterson has been speaking to Master about it. Ice-cold fear washed over Eleanor. There's nothing improper happening. He's simply an excellent horseman who's been helping me improve my riding. It doesn't matter what's happening, ma'am, Mary said gently. It only matters what people believe is happening. And Mr. Montgomery is not a forgiving man when his pride is at stake. Eleanor closed her eyes, water lapping at her chin. Thank you for telling me, Mary. After bathing and dressing, Eleanor made her way downstairs to the drawing room where Richard was entertaining their guests. She pasted on her most charming smile as she entered, playing the role of devoted wife and gracious hostess. Ah, here she is, Richard announced, his tone pleasant enough, though Eleanor didn't miss the coolness in his eyes. My dear, you remember the Caldwells from Richmond and the Prestons from Charleston? For the next several hours, Eleanor engaged in the superficial pleasantries expected of her, all while her mind raced with worry. If Patterson had indeed spoken to Richard about her time with Solomon, what consequences might follow? That evening, After their guests had retired, Richard summoned Eleanor to his study. The large room, lined with books Solomon had only dared to glimpse, felt oppressive as she took a seat across from her husband's massive desk. "You've been spending a great deal of time riding lately," Richard began without preamble, pouring himself a brandy without offering her one. "The doctor suggested fresh air and exercise for my health," she replied, folding her hands in her lap to hide their trembling. "And this slave, who's been accompanying you, he's been helpful with your health." The way he emphasized the word made Eleanor's skin crawl. "He's skilled with horses. Tempest responds well to him." Richard studied her face for a long moment. "Patterson tells me you've been gone for hours at a time, riding far beyond the plantation boundaries." "I've been exploring the property," she said, maintaining eye contact despite her racing heart. "I thought you would want me to familiarize myself with all aspects of Montgomery Plantation." "How considerate," Richard said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And these explorations required the company of a field hand rather than a proper escort." "He's not a field hand. He's a skilled horseman who—" "He is whatever I say he is," Richard interrupted, his voice suddenly hard. "He is my property. Eleanor, not your companion. I purchased him to work cotton, not to spend hours alone with my wife." Eleanor bit back a retort that would only worsen the situation. "I apologize if my actions have caused concern. I meant no impropriety." Richard drained his glass and set it down with deliberate care. "Your riding lessons are over. The slave in question will be reassigned to the western fields tomorrow. You will not speak to him again. But, furthermore," Richard continued as if she hadn't spoken, "during our guest's stay, you will be the perfect hostess. You will not leave the house without proper accompaniment. When this harvest festival is concluded, we will discuss what role is appropriate for you on this plantation." The threat was clear. Eleanor had been granted certain freedoms as the new mistress of Montgomery Plantation. Those freedoms could be revoked. "Do I make myself clear?" Richard asked, his tone suggesting only one acceptable answer. Eleanor lowered her eyes, hatred burning in her chest. "Perfectly clear, husband." "Good. You may go." She rose with as much dignity as she could muster and walked to the door. As her hand touched the knob, Richard spoke again. "One more thing, Eleanor. Should I hear any more disturbing reports about your interests, there will be consequences. Not just for you, but for the object of your concern. I trust I won't need to elaborate." The barely veiled threat sent a chill through Eleanor's body. She nodded once without turning, then fled to her bedroom where she finally allowed her tears to fall. In the darkness of her room, Eleanor realized the full danger of the situation. Her foolish heart had placed Solomon in jeopardy. If she tried to see him again, to warn him or say goodbye, she might seal his fate. Richard Montgomery was not known for mercy towards slaves who stepped out of place, especially those who dared to engage with his wife as an equal. As moonlight spilled across her tear-stained pillow, Eleanor faced the bitter truth. In trying to bridge the unbridgeable gap between their worlds, she had only succeeded in making Solomon's life more precarious than before. The only thing she could do for him now was to stay away. The Montgomery Plantation Harvest Festival was the social event of the season in this part of Virginia. For 3 days, the wealthiest families from surrounding counties gathered to celebrate the cotton harvest, forge business connections, and arrange marriages between suitable young people from respectable families. Under normal circumstances, Eleanor would have dreaded the endless rounds of forced socialization and meaningless pleasantries. Now, she welcomed the distraction from her heartache and worry. For 5 days, since Richard's warning, she had not caught even a glimpse of Solomon. True to his word, her husband had reassigned him to the western fields, the farthest point from the main house, where the work was most grueling. Eleanor had obediently played the role of devoted wife and gracious hostess, never straying from the house without a proper escort, engaging their guests with practiced charm that revealed nothing of her inner turmoil. "You've outdone yourself with the decorations, Mrs. Montgomery," remarked Cecilia Preston, wife of a prominent Charleston shipping magnate, as they strolled through the ballroom, where servants were arranging flowers and hanging lanterns for the evening's festivities. "Richard must be so pleased with how quickly you've adapted to managing such a grand estate." "Thank you," Eleanor replied with a practiced smile, "though I must credit the household staff for their excellent work." "How diplomatic of you," Cecilia laughed, tapping Eleanor's arm with her fan. "But we all know it's the mistress who sets the tone. Speaking of which, I've been meaning to ask about your stable master. Our Bartholomew is getting on in years, and we'll need a replacement soon. I understand you have an exceptional Negro with horses." Eleanor's heart stuttered. "I'm not sure who you mean," she lied, keeping her voice level. "Oh, Richard mentioned it last night during brandy. Said you'd discovered a slave with unusual talent with horses. The men were discussing the breeding potential, not of the slaves, of course, but of developing specialized skills." Cecilia laughed at her own joke, not noticing Eleanor's pallor. "I wouldn't know anything about that," Eleanor said stiffly. "If you'll excuse me, I should check on the kitchen preparations." She hurried away, mind racing. Richard was discussing Solomon with the other plantation owners. But why? The casual mention of breeding potential sent a chill through her. In her naivete, she had thought Richard's worst punishment would be hard labor in the fields. Now she realized he might be considering selling Solomon perhaps to one of their guests. The thought of Solomon being sent away, perhaps deeper into the South, where conditions were even more brutal, was unbearable. Eleanor paused in an empty hallway, pressing her hand against the wall to steady herself as tears threatened. "Mrs. Montgomery, are you unwell?" Eleanor turned to find Josephine Caldwell, the 20-year-old daughter of the Richmond banking family, watching her with concern. Unlike most of the vapid Southern belles in attendance, Josephine had shown herself to be thoughtful and well-read during dinner conversations. "Just a momentary dizzy spell." Eleanor composed herself quickly. "The excitement of the festival, I suppose?" Josephine studied her with intelligent eyes. "You seemed upset by something Mrs. Preston said." "Not at all," Eleanor insisted, "though I find some of the conversations here rather difficult to stomach at times." A look of understanding passed between them. "I know what you mean," Josephine said quietly. "My father insists I accompany him on these social occasions, but I find myself increasingly at odds with the values celebrated here." The young woman glanced around to ensure they were alone before continuing in a whisper. "My mother's family is from Boston. I spent summers there as a child. The conversations about human dignity and rights were quite different from what we hear in Virginia." Eleanor regarded Josephine with new interest. Could she have found an ally in this unexpected quarter? "Perhaps we could continue this conversation during a walk in the gardens later," Eleanor suggested. "I find the fresh air helps clear my thoughts." "I would enjoy that very much," Josephine replied with a meaningful look. Before they could say more, a servant appeared to inform Eleanor that more guests were arriving. The moment of potential confidence was broken, but Eleanor felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps Josephine, with her northern connections, might understand her predicament, might even be able to help. The harvest festival began that evening with a grand ball in the Montgomery mansion. The ballroom glittered with candlelight, reflecting off crystal chandeliers and ladies' jewels. A small orchestra played from the gallery as couples whirled across the polished floor. Eleanor, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that Richard had selected, moved through the crowd with practiced grace, the perfect hostess, despite the turmoil in her heart. "You've transformed this place, my dear," said Margaret Whitfield, wife of Richard's closest business associate. When Richard was a widower, these gatherings were so dreary. A woman's touch was sorely needed. "Thank you," Eleanor murmured, accepting the backhanded compliment with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Though I must say, Margaret continued, lowering her voice, some of us were concerned about Richard marrying such a young bride, particularly one with your family background. Eleanor stiffened. Her father, while respected in Richmond society, was known for his moderate views on slavery compared to the hardline stance of most plantation owners. It was one of many points of contention in her parents' decision to accept Richard's suit. My upbringing prepared me well for the responsibilities of managing a household, Eleanor replied evenly. Margaret patted her arm condescendingly. And Richard has always been firm in his guidance. A young wife needs a strong hand, especially when managing slaves. I understand there was a small misunderstanding recently. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Had Richard been discussing her private matters with the Whitfields? I'm not sure what you mean, she said carefully. Oh, nothing serious. Margaret waved dismissively. Just that Richard mentioned having to correct some confusion about appropriate interactions with the help. It happens to all new mistresses. They try to be kind, and the Negroes mistake kindness for weakness. Before Eleanor could formulate a response that wouldn't betray her anger, Richard appeared at her side, his hand possessively claiming her waist. My dear, the Prestons are asking about your famous peach preserves, he said smoothly. Perhaps you could enlighten them while I discuss business with Thomas. It was not a request. Eleanor nodded, allowing herself to be steered toward another group of guests, seething internally at being managed like a child. As she crossed the ballroom, she caught sight of Josephine Caldwell standing near the terrace doors, observing the proceedings with a detached expression that mirrored Eleanor's own inner feelings. Their eyes met briefly, and Josephine gave an almost imperceptible nod toward the gardens. The message was clear. Their planned conversation would proceed. The evening wore on interminably. Eleanor danced with Richard and various male guests, discussed household matters with the women, and maintained her facade of contented plantation mistress with increasing difficulty. All the while, her mind was on Solomon, working in the western fields, perhaps unaware of the discussions that might determine his fate. Finally, as the older guests began to retire and the younger ones broke into smaller groups for cards or conversation, Eleanor managed to slip away. She found Josephine waiting in the small rose garden, now past its prime, but still offering privacy among its trellises and benches. I was beginning to think you wouldn't come, Josephine said as Eleanor approached. It's difficult to escape one's duties as hostess, Eleanor replied, sinking onto a stone bench with relief. Thank you for waiting. Josephine sat beside her, arranging her pale blue skirts. In the moonlight, her serious face looked older than her 20 years. Mrs. Montgomery, Eleanor, please. If we're to speak frankly. Eleanor, then. And I'm Josephine. She hesitated, then continued with quiet intensity. I hope I'm not mistaken in believing you might share certain sympathies that are unpopular in our circle. Eleanor studied the younger woman carefully. Such conversations could be dangerous, even between women of their class. But something in Josephine's earnest expression convinced her to take the risk. If you're referring to sympathies regarding the fundamental dignity of all human beings, regardless of the color of their skin, then yes, Eleanor said softly, though I've learned the hard way that such views must be carefully guarded here. Josephine's face lit with relief. I knew it. There's something different about you, the way you speak to the servants, the discomfort in your eyes during certain conversations. She leaned closer. My mother's family in Boston are active abolitionists. I've been corresponding with them secretly for years. Eleanor felt a surge of hope. Then perhaps you can help me. There's someone a slave on this plantation who I believe is in danger of being sold further south. He deserves freedom, Josephine. He's brilliant, educated despite every obstacle. The stable hand, Josephine interrupted with sudden understanding. The one Mrs. Preston mentioned today. Eleanor nodded, not bothering to deny it. His name is Solomon. My husband has removed him from the stables and sent him to the western fields as punishment for spending time teaching me to ride. She didn't elaborate on the deeper connection they had formed. And now your husband is considering selling him? I fear so. I overheard discussions about his value and specialized skills. The Prestons expressed interest. Josephine was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful in the moonlight. My uncle in Boston is connected with the Underground Railroad, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. He helps slaves escape north to Canada. Eleanor's heart raced. Could you contact him? Ask for help? It's dangerous, Eleanor. For him? For the slave? For anyone involved? Josephine hesitated. And for you? If your husband suspected, I don't care about the risk to myself. Eleanor interrupted fiercely. Solomon deserves freedom. If there's any chance. Josephine studied her with new understanding. You care for him, she said simply. It wasn't a question. Eleanor didn't deny it. Please, Josephine, can you help? After a long moment, Josephine nodded. I return to Richmond in 3 days. I can send a coded letter to my uncle from there. But Eleanor, even if he agrees, arranging an escape takes time and careful planning. It could be weeks, even months. I don't think Solomon has that long, Eleanor said, desperation edging her voice. Not if Richard intends to sell him. Then we need to buy time, Josephine said practically. Is there any way you could convince your husband of Solomon's value here? Make him reconsider selling? Eleanor thought quickly. The horse breeding program. Richard is expanding it next spring. If Solomon's skills with horses were seen as essential. That's it, Josephine nodded. You need to make your husband believe keeping Solomon is in his financial interest. Men like Richard Montgomery always listen when profit is involved. A plan began to form in Eleanor's mind. It was risky, but it might work at least to delay any sale until Josephine could contact her uncle. Thank you, she said, squeezing the younger woman's hands. I was beginning to lose hope. Hope is dangerous in Virginia, Josephine replied soberly. But sometimes it's all we have. She rose from the bench. We should return separately. People will talk if we're missed. As Josephine slipped away toward the house, Eleanor remained in the garden a moment longer, gazing up at the stars. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of purpose replacing her despair. Solomon might yet have a chance at freedom if she could play her role convincingly enough to deceive Richard. She had never considered herself particularly cunning or deceptive. As the pampered daughter of a wealthy family, she'd had little need for such skills. But now, with Solomon's future hanging in the balance, Eleanor found herself calculating and plotting with a cold determination that would have shocked her former self. Whatever it takes, she whispered to the night sky, a vow and a prayer, combined. Whatever it takes to set him free. The next morning, Eleanor put her plan into action. She sought out Richard in his study, where he was meeting with Thomas Whitfield and Charles Preston. The men looked up in surprise as she entered, without knocking something she had never dared before. Gentlemen, forgive the interruption, she said with a confidence she didn't feel. I need to discuss an urgent matter regarding the horse breeding program, Richard. Her husband's expression darkened at her presumption. Eleanor, we are in the middle of important business discussions. This is business, she insisted. Mr. Preston, I believe you expressed interest in our horse training methods yesterday. Charles Preston, a portly man with calculating eyes, nodded. Indeed, Mrs. Montgomery, your husband mentioned a particularly skilled Negro who has a way with difficult horses. Exactly, Eleanor said, seizing the opening. And I've just learned that Midnight Star is showing signs of colic again. The new stable master can't calm her, and she's one of our most valuable broodmares." Richard frowned. "Patterson didn't mention this to me. It just happened this morning," Eleanor improvised. "The mare won't let anyone near her. She's in considerable distress." "What does this have to do with our discussion?" Richard asked impatiently. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "The slave who was reassigned to the western fields, Solomon, is the only one who can handle Midnight Star when she's like this. If we lose her, we lose next season's foals and the considerable investment she represents." She turned to Preston. "You were asking about specialized skills." "Mr. Preston, this is precisely what makes Montgomery horseflesh superior. We have a training system that produces exceptional results, but it requires certain specialized handlers." Preston's interest was clearly piqued. "Fascinating. I'd be very interested in seeing this system in action." Richard studied Eleanor suspiciously, but she could see the calculation in his eyes. Midnight Star was indeed one of their most valuable horses, worth a small fortune for her breeding potential. "Perhaps a demonstration could be arranged," Eleanor suggested. "This afternoon, once the mare is stabilized, it would be an excellent opportunity to showcase the methods that make Montgomery horses so sought after." She held her breath as Richard considered. If he called her bluff and went to the stables immediately, he would discover no sick horse. But she was counting on his reluctance to leave his guests and his pride in showing off his plantation's assets. "Very well," Richard finally said. "Have Patterson bring the slave back to the stables to tend to Midnight Star. We'll arrange a demonstration for this afternoon." Eleanor nodded, careful not to show her relief. "Thank you, husband. Gentlemen, I apologize again for the interruption." As she left the study, her heart pounded with a mixture of triumph and terror. She had bought Solomon a temporary reprieve from the fields and created an opportunity for him to demonstrate his value. But now she needed to hurry to the stables and somehow create the crisis she had invented. Mary was waiting in the hallway, concern evident on her face. "Mrs. Montgomery, is everything all right?" "Mary, I need your help," Eleanor said in a low voice. Immediately, within the hour, Eleanor had enlisted Mary's assistance in spreading word to the stables that Midnight Star was to be isolated and reported as ill with colic. Patterson, though confused by the sudden orders, didn't dare question the mistress directly. By midday, Solomon had been brought back from the western fields, ostensibly to deal with the crisis. Eleanor watched from her bedroom window as he was led across the yard toward the stables. Even from a distance, she could see the evidence of hard labor in his gait, a slight stiffness that hadn't been there before. Her heart ached at the thought of the suffering her actions had inadvertently caused him. But there was no time for regrets. The afternoon demonstration would determine whether her plan succeeded or failed, and Solomon, still unaware of the deception she had orchestrated, was the key to its success. As she turned from the window to prepare for the afternoon's performance, Eleanor caught sight of her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was someone she barely recognized, calculating, manipulative, willing to lie to her husband and deceive their guests, all for the sake of a man she could never openly claim to love. "Whatever it takes," she reminded her reflection softly. "Whatever it takes." The afternoon demonstration became the highlight of the harvest festival. Eleanor had secretly communicated with Solomon through Mary, explaining just enough of her plan for him to understand what was needed. Midnight Star, a temperamental black thoroughbred, performed perfectly. By the time Richard arrived with Preston, Whitfield, and other guests, the mare was agitated, refusing Patterson's attempts to calm her. "See what I mean?" Eleanor gestured toward the nervous horse. "She's been like this all morning." Richard frowned. "Patterson, why wasn't I informed earlier? The mistress said she would tell you. We've tried everything. She won't take feed or let anyone examine her." "Where's the slave who supposedly can handle her?" Preston asked. Bring him, Richard ordered. Solomon appeared moments later, his face carefully blank. Only Eleanor noticed the slight tremor in his hands. This is the one with the special touch? Preston asked skeptically. Apparently so, Richard replied coolly. Let's see this remarkable skill. What followed was masterful. Solomon approached the agitated mare with calm confidence. He spoke in low tones, his body language conveying respect for the powerful animal. Within minutes, he had entered the stall and was checking for signs of genuine colic, while demonstrating his extraordinary connection with the horse. Remarkable, breathed Preston. I've never seen anything like it. The horse whisperer, murmured another guest admiringly. Even Richard couldn't hide his surprise. Eleanor watched her husband's expression shift from suspicion to calculation. He was trained in Kentucky, Eleanor said. His father worked with racing thoroughbreds. It's a gift that can't be taught. Is she actually suffering from colic? Richard asked Solomon directly. No, sir. She's showing signs of anxiety. Not illness. Something frightened her. With proper handling, she'll be fine by evening. His educated voice clearly surprised the guests. Eleanor saw several exchanging glances as Preston's interest intensified. Montgomery, Preston said. I'd be very interested in implementing similar training methods on my plantation. Perhaps this man could spend time in Charleston, teaching my stable hands. Eleanor's heart sank. Instead of securing Solomon's position, she might have inadvertently created a situation where he would be sent away or sold at a premium. Richard, however, had other ideas. I'm afraid that wouldn't be possible. His skills are essential to our breeding program. Patterson. Yes, sir. This slave is to be returned to stable duties permanently. He'll work with the breeding stock and train others in his methods. Eleanor fought to keep her expression neutral despite her relief. Her gamble had worked, at least in buying time. A wise decision. Preston nodded. Perhaps you might consider breeding the talent? Surely there are female slaves with similar aptitudes. The suggestion treating humans like livestock turned Eleanor's triumph to ash. She saw the flash of contained rage in Solomon's eyes before his expression returned to careful blankness. An interesting proposition, Richard replied. We'll discuss it further over brandy. When the others left, Eleanor approached Solomon. I'm sorry, she whispered, for everything. Don't be, he replied softly. You did what you could. It's not enough, Eleanor said, the way they spoke about you. I've heard worse. This is our reality. It doesn't have to be, she whispered urgently. I've found help, someone who might arrange your passage north. His hands stilled momentarily. That's dangerous talk. More dangerous to stay. Richard won't sell you now, but after hearing Preston's suggestions, Solomon finally looked directly at her. Why would you risk everything for me? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken feelings. Footsteps approaching silenced her. We'll speak again, she murmured as Patterson rounded the corner. That evening, as the festival reached its peak with a formal dinner, Eleanor played her role flawlessly, all while her mind was in the stables where Solomon tended the horses, in the uncertain future where his freedom hung in the balance. You seem distracted, observed Josephine Caldwell during a lull in the after-dinner entertainment. Just tired, Eleanor replied. I leave tomorrow morning. Is there anything you wish me to purchase for you in Richmond? Yes, she said, keeping her voice light. There's a book of poetry I've been wanting, Whittier's latest collection. John Greenleaf Whittier was a prominent abolitionist poet. The request would signal to Josephine's uncle both Eleanor's sympathies and her intent. I believe I know exactly where to find it, Josephine replied meaningfully. Later that night, Eleanor found Mary waiting to help her undress. There's talk below stairs, ma'am, about Solomon. What kind of talk? Mr. Patterson has been telling everyone how the master brought him back because of your intervention. Some are saying you have an unnatural interest in him." Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Of course Patterson would suspect. A soft knock interrupted them. Josephine stood in the hallway in her nightgown. "May I come in? It's important." "I overheard my father and Richard talking," Josephine said once inside, "about Solomon." "What did they say?" "Richard has agreed to loan him to the Prestons for the spring to help train their horses, and to—" Josephine hesitated. "To breed with 2 of their female slaves who show aptitude with animals." Eleanor gripped a chair to steady herself. "He's to be treated as livestock. There's more. If the arrangement proves satisfactory, Preston wants to purchase him permanently." Richard named a price 3 times the usual rate, and Preston agreed. "When?" "Solomon leaves with the Prestons in 2 days. 2 days. Not the weeks Eleanor had counted on for Josephine to arrange an escape route. "We have to move now," Eleanor said, determination replacing shock. "Tonight. But without proper preparation, without a network." "I have money," Eleanor interrupted, moving to her jewelry box. "My grandmother's jewelry. My savings. Enough for passage north if he can reach Philadelphia." "Eleanor, this is madness. The chances of a lone slave making it from Virginia to Philadelphia, what choice does he have? Become a breeding stud on Preston's plantation?" Josephine was silent for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right, but he'll need help, directions, papers, connections." "Can you provide any of that?" "Not papers, but I know the first contact in Richmond. A free black blacksmith who helps runaways. I can draw a map, write a letter of introduction." As Josephine wrote, Eleanor gathered what she could: jewelry, money, a small compass, food, warm clothing. "Eleanor," Josephine said, looking up, "if you're caught helping him escape, I know the risks, but I can't let him be sold like an animal." Josephine studied her. "You love him," she said simply. Eleanor didn't deny it. "Will you help me get a message to him tonight?" Josephine nodded. "I'll create a diversion at breakfast tomorrow. Something to keep Richard occupied while you say your goodbyes." As she finally lay in bed, Eleanor faced the reality of what tomorrow would bring. If Solomon escaped, she would likely never see him again. If he was caught, he would face brutal punishment, and she would be implicated. If he refused to run, he would be lost to her forever. Every possibility brought pain. Yet for the first time since her marriage, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened, she was finally acting according to her true beliefs. "Whatever it takes," she whispered into the darkness. "Love demands courage above all else."